Class confusion. SpongeBob, look out! Shrieked Mrs. Puff, but it was too late. Screech! Crash! Boom! Boom! Boom!
Oops! Sorry, Mrs. Puff, said SpongeBob. I guess I forgot to put my blinker on. Looks like I failed my boating test. Again.
I'm calling in sick tomorrow, Mrs. Puff muttered. I need a little me time. The next day, SpongeBob arrived early for boating school, as usual. He breathed in deeply as he entered the front doors.
Behold the halls of learning,
he said to himself.
And here's the fountain of learning, which I drink from every day.
He took a sip from the drinking fountain, then continued down the hall. At the classroom door, SpongeBob's voice quavered.
And inside that room is the one who makes it all happen.
Slowly, he pushed open the door.
Ah, yes, indeed. Inside this room is my teacher, the one and only Mrs. Ah!
Mrs. Puff was not at her desk. Instead, there was a substitute.
Where's Mrs. Puff?
SpongeBob finally asked. The substitute did not even look up from the magazine he was reading. Out today, he said, turning a page. Have a seat. SpongeBob sank heavily into his chair. Psst, said a voice next to him. It was Horace. I have a really funny idea, whispered Horace. Let's play a trick on the sub. I'll pretend to be you, and you pretend to be me, okay? It'll be hilarious, Horace said, snickering.
I guess so,
said SpongeBob. He really didn't mind. The substitute stood up. He was holding a clipboard. Time to take attendance, he said. Susie? Here, said Susie. Franco? Here, said Franco. SpongeBob? Here! Yelled Horace before SpongeBob could say anything. Horace? There was a pause. Is Horace here today? SpongeBob felt a poke in his ribs.
Oh yeah, here,
said SpongeBob as Horace snickered some more. The substitute began passing out pieces of paper. Today you're supposed to take a test, he said. Everyone groaned except SpongeBob, whose eyes shone with excitement. A test! Don't forget to write your names at the top, said the substitute before sitting back down at his desk. Psst, whispered Horace to SpongeBob. Horace pointed to his own test where he had written the name SpongeBob, and Horace pointed at SpongeBob's paper. SpongeBob wrote Horace at the top of his own test. After the test, the substitute told the class, Okay, now open your manuals and read or something. SpongeBob's hand shot up.
Mrs. Puff usually reviews the homework with us, and then after that, she teaches us the lesson of the day, and whoever has the most class participation, usually me, gets to stay after school and collect the erasers.
The substitute blinked at SpongeBob. Is that right? He looked down at his clipboard. Horace? Well, I do things a bit differently, but you just reminded me. Your teacher left me a list of students who are to stay after school for extra help. He glanced at a sheet of paper. Oh, just one student. That will be you, SpongeBob. He pointed at Horace. Horace looked over at SpongeBob and winked. After school, SpongeBob walked home very slowly. Hey, SpongeBob, called Patrick. Why the sad face?
Mrs. Puff wasn't at school today.
SpongeBob began.
And there was a sub who didn't do anything the right way, and I was supposed to stay after school for extra help, but Horace was pretending to be me, so he got to stay, and I...
SpongeBob burst into tears.
Aww.
Patrick patted his friend on the back. Don't worry, SpongeBob, he said. I'm sure Mrs. Puff will be back tomorrow, and everything will be back to normal. You'll be failing another driving test before you know it.
I hope so,
SpongeBob said, sniffling. The next day, SpongeBob held his breath as he entered the classroom. There, sitting at her desk, was his beloved Mrs. Puff. She was looking well rested.
Oh, Mrs. Puff,
gushed SpongeBob.
I sure am glad to see you.
Mrs. Puff smiled. Ah, yes, I feel very refreshed after my, sick day, she said.
Mrs. Puff, the sub forgot to give us homework, even though I reminded him 3 times,
said SpongeBob, but Mrs. Puff wasn't listening. She was staring at a note. It seems that the substitute gave you all the final exam by mistake. And instead of keeping one student after school for extra help, he sent that student to retake his driving test. All the color suddenly drained from her face. And that student passed his driving test! Who was the student? Franco asked. Mrs. Puff paused before announcing. It was SpongeBob! Everyone gasped. SpongeBob had passed his driving test at last!
I passed at last!
SpongeBob yelled to everyone as he walked home, even though he didn't remember taking the test again. Hey, no more school, SpongeBob, said Patrick. We can play all day! SpongeBob grinned.
Yeah, that's great, Patrick! No more homework, no more school, no more... Mrs. Puff?
Suddenly, he realized what this meant.
Oh no!
He wailed. The next day, SpongeBob forgot about Mrs. Puff for a while. He was too excited to get behind the wheel of a boat all by himself.
I'm ready!
He shouted. A small crowd had gathered to watch SpongeBob drive alone for the first time. He had rented a limited edition Halibut GXT for this special occasion. Even Mrs. Puff was there. I just don't understand it, said Mrs. Puff to herself. How did he manage to pass his driving test? It's time for me to move far away. I don't want to be around when SpongeBob is driving. Vroom, vroom. SpongeBob revved up the engine. Then he noticed his teacher standing nearby. His heart grew heavy. He started to tear up.
Even though I'm really glad I finally got my license, I sure am going to miss being in your class, Mrs. Puff,
he said.
Goodbye, Mrs. Puff.
SpongeBob stepped on the gas pedal and the boat flew forward and screeched to a halt in the middle of the intersection. Suddenly, a siren wailed and a police cruiser zoomed up. 2 officers hopped out. Hey, you didn't stop at that stop sign, said one officer. License, please?
Yes, sir, officer, SpongeBob replied. Here it is, brand new and never used.
The officer studied the license. Seems there's a problem, he said. You passed the driving portion of the boarding test, but you failed the written exam. SpongeBob looked at the test that the officer was holding up. Of course! It was the test that Horace had taken, pretending to be SpongeBob. And Horace had failed. And Horace must have passed the driving test while pretending to be SpongeBob. I'm afraid you'll have to go back to boarding school, the officer said. SpongeBob started to cry. Even Mrs. Puff felt bad. Aw, don't cry, SpongeBob, said Mrs. Puff. "You'll get your license one day,"
No, Mrs. Puff,
said SpongeBob.
I'm crying because I'm so happy. I thought I'd never see you again.
And he leapt out of the boat and into the arms of his startled teacher. "I need a vacation," moaned Mrs. Puff softly. The end.